Good afternoon, Shabbat Shalom. I am not a prophet, but some of you have heard me make this prediction before. Some of you have not heard this, and so I'll make it again. 3 days after the election day in the United States, for those of you who are Americans listening to this, 3 days after the American election day, 3 days after, all the banks will be closed and there'll be soldiers in the street. Why? Veterans Day. I first heard that back in 1960. I laughed then. I was astounded at first, then I chuckled. Hope you've chuckled as well. We are in an exciting time in the United States. Maybe for some a depressing time. But the process this year has become more apparent to everybody. And as one of my sons told me, now people are seeing how the sausage is made. And so it becomes a little more, I guess, messy mentally when you're more aware of the what goes on behind the scenes. I wanted to drink a little more of the wisdom of the book of Ecclesiastes, Kohelet. I call this talk Convenor's Comments for a Convocation. Convenor's Comments for a Convocation. As you know, the Sabbath is a Mikra Kodesh. It's a holy convocation. It's a time to gather and to be taught. And the convener or the assembler is Kohelet. His book is called in English Ecclesiastes. Sometimes his name is translated the preacher, Kohelet, the preacher. And there's a tremendous amount of wisdom in that book. And I always talk about it, or I try, during the Festival of Tabernacles when it is traditionally read in the synagogue. So you can check that talk out. I think it's called an autumnal scroll, or the autumnal scroll, I guess I called it, because it's the particular scroll that's read publicly of the 5 festival scrolls, or sometimes in the big King James English they're called rolls. But we're not talking about pastry here. We're talking about scrolls that you read, and it is the 4th of the 5 festival scrolls. It's read in the autumn of the year, normally during the Festival of Tabernacles, or at times on the 8th day of Sacred Assembly. And since we're not long after that time, we're kind of in the afterglow of the festival. I wanted to keep up the momentum of the festival, and I hope that you're keeping up the momentum. That you, I hope that your spiritual batteries were recharged during the festival, and you're still, in effect, going on that spiritual adrenaline even now. And I want to talk more about the book of Ecclesiastes. I want to go to Matthew, the 12th chapter, because that's a scripture that you might have heard read wherever you attended a service on the 8th day of Sacred Assembly. The minister would have perhaps referred to or read Matthew 12 and verse 42. In Matthew 12 and verse 42, it says, "The queen of the south will rise up in the judgment with this generation and condemn it. For she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and indeed a greater than Solomon is here." The wisdom of Solomon. And we're going to be listening to some of that. The book of Ecclesiastes traditionally was a work of Solomon, Shlomo HaMelech, the wise King Solomon, who unfortunately was so wise, but thought of himself as a kind of exception to the rule, and somehow didn't take his own advice until very, very late in his life, or at least not enough. You can read about his career and where he failed, but evidently he's responsible for the book of Ecclesiastes. But I want to go to Matthew 16 because there's a very important lesson in the book, which is summarized, I think, here in Matthew 16 and verse 26. It's so important to leave this world better than you found it. It's so important to have meaning to your life, to contribute to the advancement of the human race. That's what's really going to give you satisfaction as you age, rather than all the prizes you've won, or acquisitions that you've garnered. And of course, if you if you are a believer, which most of you are who are listening to me, then you understand that we are ultimately accountable to a higher power, and that in fact there is a plan that he is working out. So we certainly want to be in step with it, and that's really the most important part of our lives, the all, as the book of Ecclesiastes tells us. And in Matthew 16 and verse 26 it says, "For what profit is it to a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? Or what will a man give to exchange for his soul?" So if you are just worthless, you may have accomplished a lot in certain ways, but if you have not really been of a benefit to humankind, then what good is all that? And besides that, we understand there's more to life than the physical. There is the spiritual. So what good is it if you have quote unquote done well in this physical life but blown it for eternity? So let's go to the book of Ecclesiastes. I want to go over a couple of chapters as time allows, and if I have to cut this short, I will, because the book is in the Bible. You can read it all, and you'll hear from me over the years, God willing, about the book, or others from others. But I'll do what I can do this afternoon. I want to go to Ecclesiastes 4. Then I returned and considered all the oppression that is done under the sun. So one of the things that makes life at times depressing is when we realize the oppression that occurs. Now, there's no excuse for that to be happening, though, in the Church of God. We can at least deal with it within our own community. We can be Christian in the way we govern. And as Christians, we can do the best we can to be in a community where we are governed as Christians. We do have an option in that regard, to seek out a place where the government is administered in love and based on love. And if we are in a position to govern, that we are basing our government on that principle, unselfish, outgoing concern. Then I returned and considered all the oppression that is done under the sun, and looked at tears of the oppressed, but they have no comforter. On the side of their oppressors there is power, but they have no comforter. Therefore I praise the dead who are already dead more than the living who are still alive. Sometimes that is the feeling you get. You get so depressed, and you think, well, maybe it would have been better off not even to been on the earth, when you know of all the wrongdoing that goes on. Yet better than both is he who has never existed, who has not seen the evil work that is done under the sun. So sometimes you think that way. I wish I'd never known about all of this. But if you put all the book together, you see that there are times when these feelings come over you, but then you have to look at the bigger picture. Again, I saw that for all toil and every skillful work of man, Then again, I saw that for all toil and every skillful work, a man is envied by his neighbor. This also is vanity and grasping for the wind. It's really sad, but we have this competitive nature in us, and we want to outdo the people around us. And we want to. In America, we talk about keeping up with the Joneses, and a lot of advertising is based on that. Be the first one on your block to own this new gadget, and so on. Or why aren't you, why aren't you up to date? Why don't you have one of these that others have, and so forth? This competitive nature that we have. But on the other hand, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't strive and work and try to accomplish something. It doesn't mean that we don't want to support our families. It doesn't mean that there's a virtue in being poor. Now, as Tevye the milkman famously said, I realize, of course, it's no shame to be poor, but it's no great honor either. So I was in an organization that put out a booklet called Does God Hate the Rich? And of course, no. He's very happy. I'm speaking metaphorically, and God is happy with a person who works hard and accomplishes something and does well as a result, and has a high standard of living. That's not wrong. It's interesting. Sometimes people don't quite hear what you're telling them, or don't quite write it out correctly. We got a request one time for the booklet, Does God Hate the Witch? That wasn't what we wrote. But no, God doesn't hate the rich. It's not wrong to do well. We don't have to take pride in not doing well. We can try to do the best we can and be content if we have enough. We shouldn't be greedy and covetous, but nor should we envy those who have more and think that somehow they're less righteous than we are. If they got it honestly, they're entitled to it, right? Verse 7, then I returned, and I saw vanity under the sun. There is one alone without companion. He has neither son nor brother, yet there is no end to all his labors, nor is his eye satisfied with riches. But he never asks, for whom do I toil and deprive myself of good? This also is vanity and a grave misfortune. So some people are very miserly, and yet they're hermits, and so they're amassing all of this wealth and not really spending it on themselves, but they don't really have anybody else to spend it on either. There are personality types like that. Two are better than one, because they have a good reward for their labor. So the book of Ecclesiastes, was written for an assembly. It was written to be delivered in front of a group. He is the Kohelet, he's the assembler, the convener, the preacher. And that's why it's called in English Ecclesiastes. So we have to understand the importance of community. And we understand that for a man and a woman, it's best that they be, that they have a mate, as God says. And ideally, one man, one woman for life is the ideal. On the other hand, if a person is single, then that means that person is able to focus more on the community and not on the needs of his own household so much as on the needs of the community. So that can be an asset if you utilize it properly. But that means you still want to be outward looking and be concerned with how you can be with others and help others. We live with people. There was a book about the Jewish culture of Eastern Europe by, I believe it was Zabrowski and Herzog were the authors. Very famous book that anthropologists studied, folklorists, and I think it was really had a lot of influence on the writers of Fiddler on the Roof. I don't know this to be absolutely a fact, but anyway, the book was called Life is with People, and it talked about the culture of the Jewish community in Eastern Europe. Life is with people. Two are better than one because they have a good reward for their labor. For if they fall, one will lift up his companion. But woe to him who is alone when he falls, for there is no one to help him up. So it's important to have a social circle. Of course, to have a family. Again, if two lie down together, they will keep warm. But how can one be warm alone? Though one may be overpowered by another, two can withstand him. And a threefold cord is not quickly broken. So if you can have actually three together, that can really strengthen that individual when there's two others. And it talks about in the Psalms how when parents have a lot of children, it can be a great blessing. As they get older, they have these children, they have a network. It really does make a difference. And the Bible does talk about three as being decisive. A threefold cord is not quickly broken. We understand in the culture of the Bible, 3 is the revelatory number, the number of decision. Better is a poor and wise youth than an old and foolish king who will be admonished no more. So I think maybe Solomon was here talking about himself. For he comes out of prison to be king. Sometimes a person can come out of that kind of background. He can be somebody who had a very rough past but straightened up and then becomes a success. It can happen. For he comes out of prison to be king, although he was born poor in his kingdom. There are rags to riches stories, as you know. I saw all the living who walk under the sun. They were with the second youth who stands in his place. So one comes and then another comes, and there's the leader, and then there's the up-and-coming heir apparent, and you know how it goes. We're into the political season in America, so we understand how it goes. There was no end, I'm in verse 16, of all the people over whom he was made king. Yet those who come afterward will not rejoice in him. Surely this also is vanity and grasping for the wind. Yeah, a person can be very popular, beloved, and then he dies, and then we go on to another ruler, and over time he's barely remembered. How many Americans? Now, I took pride in naming all of our presidents, but I was a history major. But how many Americans can name many of our former presidents, for example? Walk prudently when you go to the house of God, and draw near to hear rather than to give the sacrifice of fools, for they do not know that they do evil. I talked about this during the festival, the recent festival, and they tell you, if you're wise and you listen, you have 2 ears and 1 mouth. All of us have 2 ears and 1 mouth. Even in the Hebrew alphabet, ayin comes before pei. So in other words, look before you open your mouth. The ayin means eye, and pei means mouth. And ayin comes before pei. So that's a kind of a lesson, look before you open your mouth. Do not be rash with your mouth, and let not your heart utter anything hastily before God. For God is in heaven and you on earth. Therefore, let your words be few. Some of us have a tendency to talk too much. This is one of my lines that a lot of you have heard before. You're going to groan, some of you. But I tell people it's important to speak another language, to speak several languages. But it's a real priceless virtue to be able to keep your mouth shut in one language. For a dream comes through much activity, and a fool's voice is known by his many words. So just as when you have a tendency to continue thinking about things that if you got very preoccupied during the day, they might tend to occupy you also in the evening. And the same thing, a person can be seen. You can be seen. You can kind of know what you were worrying about during the day by your dreams at night, and you can know a fool, by the fact that he just goes on and on and on. When you make a vow to God, do not delay to pay it, for he has no pleasure in fools. Pay what you have vowed. So therefore, be careful not to make vows. We don't vow. The New Testament warns about that. Better not to vow than to vow and not pay. It damages your character to make a promise if you don't pay, so be careful. I remember in the Haredi community, the ultra-Orthodox community in which I spent some of my youth, we used to say something and then we would say, Beli neder. I'm saying this, but it's not a vow. We were trying to protect ourselves. Better not to vow than to vow and not pay. Do not let your mouth cause your flesh to sin, nor say before the messenger of God that it was an error. Why should God be angry at your excuse and destroy the work of your hands? So sometimes we really are irresponsible, and then we try to talk our way out of it, and it's just and people say, come on, you blew it, just admit it, you made a terrible mistake, instead of trying to justify yourself or excuse yourself. For in the multitude of dreams and many words there is also vanity, but fear God. So we may be impressed with our eloquence and what we can write and what we can speak, and yes, there are those who have made a wonderful contribution that way, but realize that what's important is our relationship to God, and not necessarily how we can impress people with our words. If you see the oppression of the poor and the violent perversion of justice and righteousness in a province, do not marvel at the matter. Oftentimes you will see problems, but then oftentimes too they're dealt with after a while, because somebody else comes along, and there's powers above powers above powers, and fortunately there are people who are competent, and often when there's an abuse, somebody else comes in and is corrected. That is often the case. It's the case often in your company or in your school or in your group where you see abuses, but then you do see eventually that somebody else comes along with enough authority to deal with it. I've had that experience. I was in an organization which was rather hierarchical in structure, so I had to be careful. But if somebody was kind of on my case, there'd be somebody else who sort of to take up for me. So it worked out generally. If you see the oppression of the poor and the violent perversion of justice and righteousness in a province, do not marvel at the matter, for a high official watches over high official, and higher officials are over them. So often the matter can't ultimately be dealt with. Moreover, the profit of the land is for all. Even the king is served from the field. So we have to understand that all of us basically rely on the resources of the earth. The wealth comes from these resources. And sometimes if we're far removed from them, we don't appreciate that. Don't appreciate those who actually produce the wealth, those who mine, those who farm, and so forth. He who loves silver will not be satisfied with silver. No, he who loves abundance with increase. This also is vanity. It's so interesting. Those of us who are not the really rich in the world, relatively speaking, we often think, well, these people they seem like they want to have more and more and more, and that's what happens to one. I think when he gets into that pursuit of wealth, it's like there's never enough. When goods increase, they increase who eat them. So what profit have the owners except to see them with their eyes? So a lot of times, when you do amass wealth, you have to then spend it, in order to keep your business going. You're going to have to employ more people and so on. It's kind of a cycle, never-ending cycle. Or as your family gets larger, you have to take care of those in the family. So often life is a struggle, no matter how you slice it. One thing that's interesting to me is that after all these years of history, millennia of history, still the average person spends an awful lot of his time just surviving. Even though we're in 2016, we've had so much history. When you figure how much time it takes you to prepare for work, get to work, come home from work, and spend time at work, and then whatever you're thinking about, involving your work when you're not there, think of all the time that all of us spend, from the time we reach puberty to the time we're aged, just for survival, even after all these centuries. It's really interesting. But on the other hand, if a person does a day's work and does what has to be done to survive, you come home that night, you've put in a day's work, and you can go to sleep and relax, and you can take satisfaction in what you've done. The sleep of a laboring man is sweet, whether he eats little or much, but the abundance of the rich will not permit him to sleep. Believe it or not, a lot of people who aren't so rich are more content than many of those who are. A lot of people don't believe that. You can tell them, the Bible can tell them, and they still don't believe it. They still wish that they were very rich. But then, if you read the lives of those who are, it's not necessarily more pleasant than the worker. There is a severe evil which I have seen under the sun: riches kept for their owner to his hurt. That's a problem too. And sometimes I think that often occurs in the entertainment industry. And I think one reason why they get into trouble there is the pressure that they feel. And you're always getting in front of people. I know that even as a teacher, please, I don't want to compare myself to a famous entertainer, but a person who gets up in front of people, even as a teacher, there's a certain pressure one feels. And what about somebody who's, expected to do a great performance? People have spent a lot of money. There's thousands of people in the auditorium. They've bought tickets. You're supposed to really, give them a thrilling evening, and night after night after night. And so the pressure often causes people to have a lot, but then actually to spend it on things that hurt them. And I think part of it is a response to the pressure of what they do. I'm now in verse 15. As he came from his mother's womb naked, shall he return. That's pretty much, the way it is, right? To go as he came, and he shall take nothing from his labor, which he may carry away in his hand. We have that saying in America, in English, you can't take it with you. That's just the way it is. And that's really what the book is telling us, we can't take it with us. So it doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to do well, physically speaking, but just remember the priority is spiritual, that ultimately what we take with us is the character we have built. As I said, it doesn't mean that one should be ascetic. No. You see, the book does not recommend that. It recommends you enjoy life, but at the same time, keep in mind the ultimate purpose. And this also is a severe evil. Just exactly as he came, so shall he go. And what profit has he who has labored for the wind? So that's one way to look at it. There, in one sense, you can say, I've done all this, and then I go in, and what somebody else enjoys it. Now, at least, if it's somebody that you care about, you can be happy about that. But what we're seeing in Ecclesiastes are just getting into some of the more philosophical thoughts one can have about life when one is in that kind of a mood. And Solomon, of course, was in that kind of mood when he wrote this book. And he was being inspired by God to put these thoughts down here so we could contemplate them over the centuries. All his days he also eats in darkness, and he has much sorrow and sickness and anger. That is also true about people who, just if they're just involved, if they just care about the physical side of life, then it can be very frustrating if that's all you care about. Here is what I have seen. So now we come to a summary statement which you occasionally come up with in the book. Here is what I have seen. It is good and fitting for one to eat and drink and enjoy the good of all his labor, in which he toils under the sun all the days of his life, which God gives him, for it is his heritage. You know, the Jews were influenced by what we call wisdom literature. They were influenced by Proverbs. They were influenced by Ecclesiastes. And so the rabbis put together the Pirkei Avot, which I often referred to, because the Pirkei Avot is part of the heritage of the church. It was intertestamental teachings, and later on, of course, further teachings were added to as time went on. But they're very early in history. You know, they're put together and codified by around 200, by around AD 200. And so they reflect the teachings that would have been the teachings that Paul would have received from Gamaliel. I've said this many times. So I often refer back to Pirkei Avot. And one thing it says there is, Ezehu Ashir, who is rich, Hasameach Bechelko, he who rejoices in his portion. In other words, we do the best we can, and we are compensated for it, and it's enough for us to have what what we basically need, and we can be content with that. And if we are, we in a sense are rich, because we're content with our portion. Here is what I have seen, he says. It is good and fitting for one to eat and drink and to enjoy the good of all his labor, in which he toils under the sun all the days of his life, which God gives him, for it is his heritage. As for every man to whom God has given riches and wealth and given him power to eat of it, which is wonderful. It's wonderful if you've done well and you have your health. One of my friends used to say when I was a boy, you're a rich man if you have your health. You've probably heard your parents tell you that. As for every man to whom God has given riches and wealth and given him power to eat of it, to receive his heritage and rejoice in his labor, this is the gift of God. So as I said, God is very happy with the person who's utilized his talents, God-given talents, and has accomplished something and has, as a result, benefited from it. That's fine. That's wonderful. It's a blessing you can be grateful for. If you're in that situation, as we say in English, more power to you. More power to you, as we say in Hebrew, kol hakavod. Verse 20, for he will not dwell unduly on the days of his life. Now, there's various ways to translate that passage, but what it's saying is if you're busy and if you're accomplishing something and if you're doing well, then you're not going to be overly worried and concerned and tormented, because you're going to be busy with what you're doing and accomplishing things, and so you're not going to be constantly second-guessing yourself and getting worried and anguished, and that is obviously not what God wants us to be. He doesn't want us to be constantly tormented, worried, and anguished, as Jesus Christ pointed out in Matthew 6. So I'm in Ecclesiastes 5:20. For he will not dwell unduly on the days of his life, because God keeps him busy with the joy of his heart. So it really is God's desire for people to accomplish something and to receive a certain benefit from it and to enjoy life. He is not encouraging people to be to self-flagellate and to want to be morose. He does delight in people doing well and enjoying life. But remember, as we enjoy life, if we're able to do so, remember that ultimately the spiritual values are what really count, and that is really the message of this book. And that is really what the convener wanted to let us know, the importance of the spiritual, that all of these other matters, they come and they go. What goes on in life, there's sort of a cycle, and there's not necessarily a whole lot we can do about the way the world is on this level. But I'll tell you what, there's a lot that we'll be able to ultimately do about the way the world is, because ultimately, if we follow what's written in this book, then we're going to ultimately be spirit beings, kings and priests and judges under Jesus Christ. And in fact, we'll be able to metaphorically roll up our sleeves and make this world into a Garden of Eden. So I hope that we have benefited from going over these couple of chapters today. Convenor's comments for a convocation. All the best to you and yours.